Okay, super. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Professor Lisa Collins, Professor of Animal Science, Head of the School of Biology and Director of the National Pig Centre at the University of Leeds. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar on making better policies for food systems. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. The chat function is there at the bottom of your screen, the little speech bubble. I'm sure you're all familiar with that by now. That's where you can put any questions that you may have during the presentations, and the panelists will be able to see those questions as and when you pop them in there. So please go ahead and do that. And we are recording the presentation, so you may have seen that pop up at the beginning when you first entered. So the webinar is being recorded. If you're not comfortable with that, then you can always duck out of that and you'll be able to watch it again later. So we'll be sending a link around to the YouTube channel. So we'll be uploading this recording to that channel, and you'll be able to watch it again later. And I'm just going to introduce our speakers today. So I'm joined today by a lovely panel of speakers. First off, Dr. Leanne Jackson, who's the head of the Agro-food Trade and Markets Division in the Trade and Agricultural Directorate at the OECD. Leanne joined the OECD in 2020 after 16 years at the WTO, where her most recent position was as Councillor of Food and Agricultural Policy Research in the Economic Research and Statistics Division. When she was at the WTO, she also served as the Secretary to the WTO's Committee on Agriculture in the Agriculture and Commodities Division, where her responsibilities included the implementation and monitoring of WTO rules on agriculture and multilateral agriculture negotiations. I'm also joined by Koen de Koninck. Koen is an economist and policy analyst at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, so OECD, in Paris. And he's the lead author of the OECD report that we're going to be talking about today, Making Better Policies for Food Systems. He also was a lead author on concentration in seed markets as well. Before joining OECD, he was a management consultant with Bain & Company, and he holds a PhD in economics from the University of Leuven in Belgium. Bob Doherty is N8 Chair of AgriFood and Professor of Marketing at the University of York. Bob's also the research theme leader for food in the York Environment Sustainability Research Institute, otherwise known as YESI, and the first director of the N8 Food Systems Policy Hub. In addition, he was seconded in April 2019 to the UK Government Department DEFRA, so the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, as a policy fellow to work on food systems policy development. And last but not least, we're joined by Jonathan Brooks, who is head of the Agricultural Resources and Policies Division of the OECD Trade and Agricultural Directorate. His division is responsible for producing the annual agricultural monitoring and evaluation and biennial review of fisheries and conducting analysis of how government policies can improve the productivity, sustainability and resilience of the agricultural sector. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass on to our very first speaker. So that's Leanne Jackson. So thank you to Leanne already to share her screen. Thank you.
Actually, no screen sharing. I'm just going to talk.
Yeah, brilliant.
Even better. So it's really a pleasure to be with all of you today to discuss this topic. For some years, we've been seeing these alarming headlines about food systems being broken. And of course, this has catalyzed a lot of discussions around food systems. And this year, these have intensified as we're leading into the big UN Food Systems Summit in the second half of 2021. My team at the OECD produced a report in January looking at how to make better policies for food systems, and Koen will follow my presentation with a discussion of the details of that report. But just to kind of kick us off, I'll briefly highlight some aspects of the past, present, and future work at the OECD. So first, the OECD work related to food systems spans decades. We've worked on topics ranging from monitoring support to agriculture to modeling medium-term outlooks for agricultural markets. We've worked on developing insights on risk management and insights related to resilience and agricultural productivity and innovation. We've been collecting facts on food and agriculture for quite a long time. For over 30 years, we've shown how government support to agriculture distorts markets, harms the environment, and is largely ineffective at improving livelihoods. Which leads me to my second point, which is the report we are discussing today. Given that it's so hard to achieve reform, in our report, we're advocating for a shift in perspective from the what of food systems to the how of food systems policies. So the report highlights evidence that describes a complex triple challenge that's faced by food systems. So we expect food systems to ensure food security and nutrition and livelihoods for producers along the food chain, as well as doing it all in an environmentally sustainable way. But rather than focusing exclusively on these challenges, sorry, my thing just slipped. Rather than focusing exclusively on the challenges faced by food systems, our analysis digs into the questions of why policy reform in agriculture and food can be so difficult. And as we start adopting this type of systems perspective, it's really clear that addressing these challenges in a coherent way requires better coordination and communication among all different parts of government and with many different stakeholder groups in the food system. So the report highlights some insights into the process of policy reform and points out that there are disagreements over facts, interests, and values that can get in the way of these necessary policy reforms. And Koen will be talking a bit more about that in his presentation. To create better policies, we need more than facts and evidence. We also need a shared view of how the world should be. So our report provides some insights into policymaking processes that can help generate trusted evidence, avoid policy capture, and also reconcile these differing values about food systems objectives. So lastly, I just want to point a little bit out about our future work. We'll continue to contribute to making better food systems policies. We're actively engaging with the preparations for the United Nations Food Systems Summit, which is picking up speed. We've been discussing with the scientific expert group and the different action tracks. We've been engaging with many different experts all along the food system, and these webinars are part of that effort to make sure that we're reaching out also into countries to talk to country policymakers. We have some work that we'll be moving into in the next stage, which relates to data gaps or knowledge gaps around food systems. So the kinds of questions we'll be looking at there are specifically related to what information is missing, but also how do we prioritize the efforts that we put into getting the information that we need to make better policies for food systems. So with that, I'll just wrap up my remarks. It's really a pleasure to be here. Just to let you know, I'm dropping off at 4:30. So if you see me disappear, unfortunately, it's to move into my next engagement. So I'll pass over the floor to Koen right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm just going to share my screen, see if that works. So if all goes well, you should be able to see this. So it's a pleasure to be here and talk about our new report on making better policies for food systems, which came out in January. But before I do that, I thought it might be useful to say a few words about the OECD itself, as I wasn't really sure whether everybody is up to speed on who we are and what we do. So in a nutshell, we are an international organization based in Paris. We consist of about 37 member states, and The Economist magazine often describes us as a club of mostly rich countries, which is not entirely incorrect. You can see that we have a small number of members, but they represent a large share of the global economy. We have about 3,000 employees, and most of those are policy analysts like myself. And we work on a range of topics, basically any kind of social, economic, or environmental challenge that governments are facing. You can be sure that somebody in the OECD is working on that. So we have people working on tax evasion, best practices in education, foreign aid, and also, of course, food and agriculture. And you'll see at the bottom that our motto is better policies for better lives. And there's different ways in which we try to achieve that goal. And one is by informing and advising governments. So we try to be a unique source of data analysis and insights. We also try to engage and influence. For example, the process of the OECD brings together policymakers from different countries to discuss with each other and to exchange good practices and experiences. And in several areas, we also set standards and provide concrete policy support. And we have a lot of work on agriculture and food, so I just want to highlight a few examples before we start talking about our report specifically. So one is the Agricultural Outlook, which we do jointly with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which every year presents 10-year projections for global agricultural markets. And we also have an annual exercise where we look at agricultural policies around the world and a similar exercise on fisheries. In addition, we have thematic work. For example, there's a lot of research that we do on innovation, productivity, and sustainability in food systems, on agri-environmental performance in OECD countries, on agricultural resilience, and many other topics beside. For example, we have work on agriculture and poverty, on obesity, on food security, on land use, on rural well-being, you name it. So there's a wide range of food systems related analysis in the OECD. Which brings us to this report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems. This is actually the first time that OECD has adopted the language of food systems. So all of the other reports talk about agriculture, talk about obesity and so on. But increasingly people are using this term food systems. And that means emphasizing the connections between areas that historically have often been treated in isolation. For example, nutrition, agriculture, the environment. Some of these areas have been in the past not really communicating to policymakers in other areas. And the idea of food systems is to overcome that and to create a more coherent view on policymaking. At the same time, as Leanne already mentioned in her introduction, when people are discussing food systems, we see that quite often it becomes a very black and white discussion. You will see people saying that food systems are broken, and then you will have other people saying, no, it isn't, everything's fine. And that is not a very useful discussion to have, because something is either broken or it isn't broken. It doesn't really tell you how you could improve things or where things have been going well and what kind of lessons you can draw from that. So we thought it would be useful to have a more pragmatic view on food systems. So our report covers three big questions. The first one is, what is the actual performance of food systems? What have been the challenges, but what also are the achievements, and what has been the role of policies? The second question is, when we talk about food systems, we mean all these interaction effects between nutrition, the environment, and so on. But that actually means that food systems are incredibly complicated. So given that complexity, how do you come up with coherent policies, by which we mean a policy that achieves a goal in one domain and doesn't make things worse in other areas or even reinforces efforts in other areas as well? So how do you do that? And the third set of questions is, we know that it's difficult to change policies in food systems, but why is that? So what stands in the way of achieving better policies? And importantly, how do you overcome those obstacles? So this corresponds to the three core chapters of our report. And in addition, we also have three detailed case studies, one on the seed sector, one on the ruminant livestock sector, and one on the processed food sector. And this corresponds to one input sector, one primary agricultural sector, and one downstream sector. And you can see that each time we chose the most controversial sector we could think of. So each chapter talks about why these issues, why that sector is controversial, and what the policy issues are in OECD countries and what some of the policy approaches have been. So let's start with the performance of food systems. And let's start by asking, what exactly do we expect from food systems? Well, we're expecting many different things from it, but I think most people would agree on a core set, which we call the triple challenge. And that is, food systems around the world are expected to provide food security and nutrition for a growing global population. In addition, food systems are also crucial for the livelihoods, the incomes of hundreds of millions of people, not just people working in agriculture and people working in fisheries, but also people working in many different stages of the food supply chain. And finally, of course, we need environmental sustainability, and we'll discuss later that food systems have an important environmental footprint. So reconciling those three is the triple challenge. And in addition, as the COVID-19 crisis has shown, we also need resilience across these dimensions. And our first chapter looks at the evidence across these different domains and concludes that things are not as black or white as it is sometimes made to seem. And in fact, if you look at the evidence, food systems have some important achievements as well as serious shortcomings. And the second important key message is that better policies can make a difference, and actually work by the OECD and by many others has identified several areas where food systems could be improved. So let's maybe start by taking a look at some of the achievements of food systems. If you go all the way back to the 1960s and you compare with today, you'll see that global population has more than doubled. At the same time, global food production has almost quadrupled. And this is a remarkable achievement. And it is not at all obvious, because if you look at the discourse in the 1960s, the 1970s, what people were saying back then, you'll find a lot of worries about overpopulation, about the coming famine. People were quite confidently predicting that there was no way that the global food system would manage to keep up with population growth, let alone increasing the availability of food per person. So this is an important achievement. At the same time, we also know that we're still far from achieving healthy diets for all. In fact, hundreds of millions of people were going hungry even before the COVID-19 crisis hit. And even before the COVID-19 crisis, it already looked like there was a reversal happening in the progress that had been made in combating undernourishment. In addition, since the 1960s or 70s, we've also seen new public health problems emerge, notably the rise of overweight and obesity. As this chart shows, that's not just a rich country problem. We've seen a very similar trend all over the world. Let's take a look then at the environmental performance of food systems. Food systems have an important environmental footprint in a number of dimensions. So this is true not only for land use, deforestation, biodiversity, water use, water pollution, but also global warming. And what is interesting is if you look at these different domains, the majority of the damage actually happens at the agricultural production stage, by which I mean not just farming, but also the stage just before, when land is cleared to make way for farmland. And historically, that kind of process, deforestation, for example, to create more room for agriculture, that was the main way in which agricultural production was increased. But around the 1960s, there was an interesting decoupling. And so even though since the 1960s, the global food system has has almost quadrupled global food production, global agricultural land use has gone up by about 10 to 15%. And it's tempting to say only 10 or 15% if you compare it with that quadrupling of production. But we have to keep in mind that even that 10% increase is an area twice the size of Greenland. So we are still talking about an enormous area that has been converted from natural landscape into farmland, which means that it has had negative environmental implications. Still, it is clear from this chart that globally the food system has managed to radically increase the production of food per unit of land. So it's interesting to ask, how exactly did food systems accomplish that? And broadly speaking, there are two main ways in which you can achieve that. One is by using more inputs per unit of land, using more irrigation water, using more fertilizers, using more pesticides, and so on. And a second approach is by using existing inputs more efficiently. And what is interesting is that between the 1960s and the early 90s, you can see that most of the growth in global agricultural output came from using more inputs per unit of land. But something changed around the 1990s, and actually the role of efficiency gains becomes more and more important. And in the last couple of years or decades even, most of the global growth in agricultural output has come from greater efficiency, which is good news for the environment. At the same time, those efficiency gains have also contributed to lower food prices, which has been good news for billions of consumers around the world, but obviously imposes challenges for farmers, especially for those farmers who do not manage to increase their own productivity. So we see that across the different dimensions, food security and nutrition, environmental sustainability, livelihoods, we see that the performance of food systems is not necessarily black or white. So there are some important achievements, but there are also some major challenges, and those challenges require effective policy responses. Unfortunately, when we then take a look at the global policy landscape, we see that a lot of the policies in place are not really effective at addressing the triple challenge, or are even counterproductive. And so the numbers I am citing here come from our report on agricultural policy monitoring and evaluation, which I highlighted earlier. This is an annual OECD publication where we look at agricultural policies around the world, and we focus on 54 countries, which means the OECD economies, as well as all other major agricultural players. And you can see that across those countries, annually, governments provide around $700 billion in support to the agricultural sector. Now, I want to be very clear here. This does not mean $700 billion in subsidies to farmers. That is a large part of it, but this $700 billion also includes, for example, the effects of protectionist trade barriers, as well as things like investments in public research and development or infrastructure. And that latter category is really important because a lot of research by OECD and others has emphasized that if you want to create a more productive, sustainable, and resilient food system, you really need those investments in R&D and in infrastructure. But that is not where most of the support is going. In fact, the vast majority of the 700 billion aims to prop up the incomes of individual producers. And within that, there's more than one way in which you could do that. There are several policy instruments that you could use for that. But unfortunately, we see that most of that happens using the most distorting policy instruments, those which are directly coupled to production. And those have a range of negative effects, not only economic and trade distortions, but also they tend to encourage an excessive use of inputs. They tend to encourage also a lack of resilience by locking farmers into certain activities. So we can see here that simply taking some of the existing support and redirecting it away from those most distorting measures towards less distorting measures, or even towards investments in R&D and in infrastructure, this would go a long way to improving the performance of food systems. In this particular case, the policy implications are relatively clear, but that is not always the case. In fact, in general, food systems are incredibly complex. There are, if you start to think about the different linkages between different domains of food systems, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. And of course, we want to create policies that will make things better and that will not accidentally make things worse in other domains. So that is the question, or the challenge of policy coherence. And given the complexity of food systems, it's easy to see why people can feel overwhelmed. Like, how on earth are you going to come up with coherent policy approaches for this? That is the topic of our second chapter. And our basic philosophy is that we should try to make things as simple as possible, but not any simpler. In that spirit, we derived some pragmatic principles for greater policy coherence. And the first one may seem a bit trivial, but it still needs to be said that it's important when people are thinking about introducing new policies, they should be thinking about possible synergies and trade-offs with other policy areas. And it might seem like a trivial thing to say, but we know that historically, a lot of the policies in food systems have been made in isolation, have been made in silos without thinking through these kinds of spillover effects. So that awareness is really important. Still, just being aware of possible effects is not enough. It's also important that you rigorously evaluate those possible interactions, because not all possible synergies and trade-offs are real or big enough to matter. To give you one specific example, when people are discussing reforming agricultural subsidies, you'll sometimes hear people say that one of the beneficial side effects of reforming agricultural subsidies might be less obesity. And what people seem to have in mind is farm subsidies are making food cheaper, therefore people eat more, and this creates obesity. Actually, the evidence shows that that effect is not real. And part of the reason is that in many countries, agricultural support is on average making food more expensive through, for example, protectionist trade barriers, rather than making it less expensive. So these kinds of, there are several good reasons to reform agricultural policies as they currently are, but getting a big benefit in terms of reduced obesity is probably not going to be one of the main effects. So it's really important that we scrutinize these kinds of possible synergies and trade-offs. An important third point here is when people start thinking about synergies and trade-offs between different policy domains, sometimes people talk about it as if these effects are set in stone. And that is not at all true. We need to think about it in terms of specific policy instruments. So let me give one example here. If we are giving farmers fertilizer subsidies in order to increase their income, then what will likely happen is that farmers will start to use more fertilizers, which in turn creates environmental pressures. So in that specific setting, there's a tension between helping the farmer and helping the environment. But it's clear that this is just an artifact of that specific choice of policy instrument. And you could easily imagine different kinds of policy instruments that would have different patterns of synergies and trade-offs. You could, for example, pay farmers for ecosystem services, and you could even, in that instrument, you could turn it around from a trade-off into a synergy. So it's really important to keep in mind that synergies and trade-offs depend on the specific instrument. And so we need to think about instruments that maximize the synergies and minimize the trade-offs. The fourth important point relates to synergies. What you sometimes see in debates around food systems when people are searching for coherent policies is people get very enthusiastic about specific initiatives that would have a lot of synergies. And one example there is, we know that if people in rich countries would shift towards a healthier diet, that might have some environmental co-benefits as well. People tend to get really excited about these possibilities, but we have to keep in mind that one policy instrument is rarely sufficient to reach all of our goals. So even the healthiest diet for humans is not going to be the most environmentally sustainable for the planet. So it's not sufficient to just have that one policy instrument in place. We need to think not just in terms of a silver bullet, but in terms of a mix of policy instruments, which together get us to where we want to be. And finally, we also have a principle regarding trade-offs, which is that trade-offs, after we've tried to come up with the best possible policy instruments to maximize synergies and minimize trade-offs, inevitably there will be some trade-offs. And it's important that when you're discussing trade-offs that you do this using the best possible technical analysis you can get. But at the same time, resolving a trade-off is never purely a technical matter. It always involves value judgments, and a societal choice. So that's very important to keep that in mind. So we hope that those pragmatic principles can go some way towards reducing the complexity of food systems. At the same time, we also know that complexity is not the only factor that stands in the way of achieving better policies for food systems. And so our third chapter looks a bit more closely at the kinds of obstacles that we face and how we can overcome them. And there's different ways of thinking about it, but the way we like to think about it is that there are disagreements over facts, interests, and values. On the one hand, we know quite a lot about food systems and about how we could improve the performance of food systems through better policies, but we also have to acknowledge that there are many areas where we don't know enough. So there is often a lack of data or evidence or knowledge on certain problems or their causes or the effects of different kinds of policy responses. So it's important that we continue to invest in evidence there. But what we also sometimes see is that in some areas we have the evidence, but there is a gap between public perception and what the evidence says. So the bottom line here is that it's essential that we build a shared understanding of the facts. At the same time, as Leanne already mentioned in her introduction, the facts can tell us how the world is. It doesn't tell us how the world should be. So inevitably, interests and values are going to come into play as well. And interests are important because any kind of change in policies will tend to create winners and losers, which means that different groups in society will have an incentive to lobby the government to move policy in their preferred direction. And by itself, that process is not necessarily a bad one. Actually, it can be very useful for policymakers to find out how a proposed initiative would really affect groups in society. Where things go wrong is if when some groups have more access to policymakers than others, and especially when certain groups are completely excluded from that policy process. So it's essential that we have policy processes that promote transparency, accountability, and the level playing field. And the OECD has a wide range of good practices and recommendations in that regard. And if you follow the discussions on food systems, you'll often see people talking about facts and people talking about interests. But there is this third element that we think is important and that doesn't always receive enough attention, and that is the role of values. And many policy disagreements in food systems have a strong value component to them. For example, discussions around genetically modified organisms or animal agriculture. And sometimes some of these debates are ostensibly about facts and interests. For example, the debate around genetically modified organisms, ostensibly that is about the health, environmental, and productivity consequences of new technology. In reality, there's a lot more going on than that. Some people may be opposed to the technology because they don't trust big corporations. Some others might feel that this new technology is just a technological fix for deeper societal problems. And yet other people might think that it's simply unethical to play God with genetics. So there's a number of ethical dimensions that come into play in some of these discussions. And it's really important that we understand those values aspects to understand disagreements on food systems. There's an additional reason why understanding values is really important, and that is that resolving a difference over values, a disagreement over values, is much harder, in theory at least, than resolving problems over facts or interests. When there's a disagreement over facts, at least in theory, you can go out and do more research. When there's a disagreement over interests, at least in theory, you could find some way of compensating those who stand to lose from a policy reform. It's much harder to see how you would do that for values. Almost by definition, a value is something that you don't want to bargain away. So how do you proceed when you're facing disagreements over values? So one solution is that you could try to think of creative adjustments to a specific policy proposal to try and make that proposal acceptable to people with very different values. And so when you can do that, that is obviously the preferred approach. But unfortunately, that's not always possible. Sometimes society will simply need to make a difficult decision. And in that case, recent work by the OECD has been investigating the potential of deliberative processes. For example, a deliberative process might take a random sample of the population, chosen to be a representative of the population. These people are then brought together and engage in facilitated discussions with themselves and with experts, and then make recommendations to the government. And there's a growing number of examples of where this process has actually helped to make progress on some very thorny issues in different societies. So you'll see that across facts, interests, and values, we're emphasizing how to make better policies. We're emphasizing policy processes or approaches to overcoming these difficulties. So in general, in our report, we are emphasizing not just the what of better policies for food systems, but importantly, the how to make better policies. And the reason is that food systems are incredibly heterogeneous. There is a lot of local variation, and it's very difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all policy recommendation that works everywhere. So rather, any kind of policy will need to be adapted to local circumstances. But then we need to make sure that the processes to make those tailored policies, that those processes are robust and evidence-based, and that they manage to overcome disagreements over facts, interests, and values. So that, in a nutshell, is our report on making better policies for food systems. And some of you may have heard of the United Nations Food Systems Summit, which will be taking place later in the year, and which is already proving to be a catalyst for policy discussions on food systems, not only at the global level, but also nationally and subnationally. The OECD is committed to contribute its expertise on food systems to that process. And I've already shown you a sampling of our work here. Much of this work has been synthesized in our report, Making Better Policies for Food Systems, but we now also have a dedicated portal page, which brings together all of the relevant OECD work on food systems. And of course, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us on this email address. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see and see so many friends and familiar faces who've attended this webinar this afternoon. I've got the pleasure of fulfilling two roles. One is to respond to the report and also to chair the Q&A session. And it's really good to see a lot of questions already going into the chat. So while I'm responding, maybe if you have a question, please do put it in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session in a few minutes. The first thing I want to do is really just commend the OECD team and Koen as well for a wonderful presentation, really succinct, but also a very, very comprehensive report. If you do get the chance to read it, and me and Lisa have read it, it's 282 pages long, and it's underpinned by an enormous amount of evidence, you know, from recent contemporary evidence, but a lot of historical evidence in there as well, and it's just fantastic. And we completely agree with you in the N8 AgriFood program. We completely agree with this food systems approach to develop more coherence and to manage friction within the food system. And for 5 years now, N8 AgriFood has really been developing its capacity and academic research in food systems. And we certainly have experienced the importance of doing interdisciplinary work in the food system. And it's something you point out in the report about bringing different perspectives together, not only research perspectives, but also stakeholder perspectives. And within the N8 AgriFood program, we've got some great examples of interdisciplinary programs that have been co-designed with stakeholders right from across the food system. So we completely agree with you on that. The report is also a very useful reminder of the importance of the food system across the world, globally, in economic terms, but also an important reminder in some of the negative consequences it does have. And there are some shocking statistics. I think for me, the one that really stands out is the deforestation, that the food system is responsible for 73% of global deforestation. And, you know, when the UK, for example, has made a commitment to developing a lighter footprint globally in its 25-year environment plan, and you'll probably see that coming out in the National Food Strategy in the summer, then we obviously have to consider transboundary impacts of our food system as well in our policy making, and certainly your report is a good reminder of that. I also think, Koen, your point about there's no silver bullet is a really, really important point, and I really do encourage everybody to read the report, because you provide a really multi-pronged framework for tackling some of these interconnected issues. And for me, working in policy, it really opened my eyes to expanding the policy toolbox. So if I take sustainable healthy diets, for example, as a theme, what's good about your recommendations in the report is that you talk about interventions and levers, both at production, in the supply chain, and also at the demand side. So thinking about the demand side, you know, public awareness about a balanced diet. If you think about production, maybe, you know, comprehensive environmental land management schemes, incentives to diversify crop production into different crop types. And then in the supply chain, you know, a mix of penalties and incentives. I do think the sugar tax levy in the UK has demonstrated the importance of penalties. But also, I think new business models that are developing, or, you know, alternatives to high-fat sugar salt foods should be incentivized with preferential loans or loan guarantor mechanisms from banks. So I think in my policy work, your report has actually really opened that, expanded my vision of what a policy toolbox could be across these kind of cross-cutting themes where you looks as though you've got trade-offs, but actually by taking a more creative approach, you can really start to you know, make a difference in the food system against some of these wicked problems. I also think in the report, there's a really useful section around managing friction. So whether that's in your co-design of research programs or whether it's developing policies, you know, bringing different stakeholders together via dialogues, bringing citizens together with farmers, with supply chains to do citizens' assemblies, to hear different perspectives, but also coupled with robust evidence, I think is a really, really good recommendation. And finally, there are some really, really good examples of innovation in the final chapter and penultimate chapter. Innovation of best case examples of where countries or regions of countries have developed kind of multi-pronged frameworks to tackling some of the wicked problems in the food system. You bring out some examples of the Nordic countries, New Zealand, Canadian food policy, how it involves citizens in the development of that. So I think for the UK, we learnt some of that, you know, from earlier discussions. And if you look at the National Food Strategy development, it's been very much about citizens' assemblies, public dialogues, you know, calls for information from academics, and those are good examples of developing policy. And yeah, even within the N8 AgriFood programme, we've had a number of citizens' assemblies and dialogues with industry and also with citizens groups. So I think it's a great report, a great example of how we can expand the toolbox for policy. And what we have now is about 15 minutes where we can throw it out for Q&A, and then we're going to have a wrap up at the end from Jonathan and Lisa. But yeah, thank you very much, OECD, for sharing this afternoon the report with our PhD students, early career academics, and also some of our leading academics within the programme as well. Thank you very much. Now, we do have already a number of questions in the chat, and the first one is from the academic director of N8 AgriFood, Catherine Denby. What do you see the role or value of citizens in you know, developing policies, particularly around judgments, around trade-offs? And I'll pass that on to Koen, I think.
Thanks, Bob, for those kind words, and thank you also for Catherine for that really interesting question. Maybe the rest of the presentation already partly answered your questions. We do think it's really important that citizens do play an important role in these trade-offs. And actually, one of the things that you sometimes notice in debates around food systems is that some people tend to see it as a technocratic issue where we just have to have the models and the evidence. And that's partly why we emphasize explicitly, well, if there is a trade-off, at the end of the day, there's a value judgment, there's a societal choice to be made there. What's tricky there, as with any kind of political decision, is how can you make sure that that choice is not only taken using the best available evidence, but it also accurately reflects the public interest, right? And that's a bit where our discussion on facts, interests, and values comes in. There's a couple of problems you could have. So one is that sometimes you have well-organized interest groups that are better represented than other groups in societies, that they might distort policymaking. And almost by definition, consumers, for example, tend to be much less well-organized. So they often tend to be one of the groups that that is not as well represented as others. But of course, future generations are by definition not represented. The environment is also cannot really represent itself, so it has to be represented by others. So there's different places there where we see that representation aspect is sometimes a problem. And when it comes to values, one of the reasons we wanted to highlight values is there is a growing awareness that the role of values is important and that we need to engage citizens in the policy process. At the same time, what you sometimes see is there's often a self-selection problem with these kinds of initiatives. If you have an open invitation to people, well, let's come and discuss food policy, who will come to that? It will be people who are already interested in food systems, and they tend to be absolutely not representative for the broader population. So there's a risk there, or a challenge there of how can you make sure that that doesn't just become a small unrepresentative group of foodies talking to each other and agreeing on how great it is to have all these lofty goals. How are you going to incorporate the concerns and the values of people who are not normally represented? And that's one of the reasons why this deliberative approach, especially the approach where a random sample of the population is taken, it's one of the reasons why that is such an interesting idea. It's not a magic solution to everything. It's not a silver bullet. But there are more and more examples now where this kind of approach actually has worked. And we had an interesting webinar on the 15th of April, so 2 weeks ago, where we explored the use of deliberative processes for food systems in a bit more detail. And that webinar has been recorded actually, so we can share that link. So that it's available on YouTube. We can share that link if that's of interest.
That's really good, Koen, because I think Sarah Bridle also asked a question about that. Is if you get a small group with you know, as you call it, a group of foodies together who come up with some really good ideas, what sort of mechanisms could you engage, maybe perhaps to get wider public support for some of those initiatives, which I think probably builds on, and maybe some of the answers are in that recording perhaps.
Yeah, I guess to some extent, but yeah, it's a very good question indeed. And I think, Sarah, you also asked, like, how do you deal with the problem that people don't have time to really study this issue, right? Which is, again, another element, another dimension of this self-selection issue. So the way that most the deliberative processes work is that they try to get, well, pre-COVID, they would try to get people together physically for a few weekends in a hotel somewhere and have them engage in face-to-face discussions with each other. So they would have discussions with each other, they would have experts present the evidence to them until everybody feels comfortable that they understand the science. So those are the good practices. Of course, not all processes are equally well organized, but those are the good practices that we've seen. And that is interesting because it actually creates space for people to engage with the evidence and ask those questions. And people do seem to be able to come up with reasoned judgments. So that might not necessarily be what the foodies would have thought of themselves, or what, you know, other subject matter experts would have considered the ideal approach. But that's, of course, part and parcel for the democratic process more generally. Right?
Thanks, Koen. Good question, Sarah. One question from Diogo at Newcastle. It's from an economist. What do you think fostered the efficiency gains in the 1990s in terms of production?
So I see that Jonathan already responded also with a link to the study by the Economic Research Service of the US Department of Agriculture, from which this is based. And so it depends by region, actually. There's different drivers for different regions. So the USDA study on which that chart is based, they decompose it for all major countries in the world. And so you can actually see country by country what exactly has happened there. There's a couple of broad sort of the big picture is that if you look at this 1960s until the 1980s, the Green Revolution, which is the general term we use for this massive increase in crop yields, especially in developing countries, it had 2 or 3 big components. And so part of the package of the Green Revolution was improved seeds, more fertilizer, and more irrigation water. And there's more than one study that actually shows that in the initial phases of the Green Revolution, it was mostly the increased use of fertilizer and irrigation water that was driving a lot of these productivity gains. But over time, it's the genetic improvements that start to take over. So this is a large part of the story. It's not a full story of efficiency gains, but a large part of it is genetic improvements through better plant breeding. So not even necessarily genetically modified organisms, even conventional plant breeding can get you more resistant varieties that do better and that are more efficient at using the fertilizer and so on. And that's not only true for crops, it's also true for animal agriculture actually. So also in animal agriculture, animal breeding, just through better breeding, you can get animals that use resources more efficiently. So that's been a large part of the story. And to give you just one number, since the 1980s, fertilizer use in US maize production has basically been flat since the 1980s. But maize yields, I think, have roughly doubled since that period. So that gap is basically, it's various kinds of efficiency gains, including better genetics and also the use of precision agriculture, where people have become much more precise at applying those inputs. But it tends to differ region by region, but those are sort of the broad strokes.
Very good, good answer. And I'm going to put the next two questions together because they're about the private sector. So one of our stakeholder partners, Alan Hayes, talks about asks you the question, what engagement have you had with, global corporations and the big retailers? And then the second question next question from Usman is about how do you reconcile the kind of move towards sustainability with profit maximizing objectives of some of the multinational corporations?
On the process itself for this report, we didn't formally engage with the private sector when we were developing this report. But well, we are of course going to events. We are organizing events, and we are going to events and so on. So of course we see what they are saying what their representatives are saying in those events, and we read the publications that they come up with. So of course we do take a very broad view when we are preparing our reports, but there was no official discussion, or they were not holding the pen, if that's the concern. On the question of how to reconcile profit maximization with better policies for food systems. So as an economist, we know that the markets can be an incredibly effective mechanism, but only if the incentives are set properly. So only if the incentives are aligned. And of course, the biggest challenges that we face globally are all cases where there are externalities, where there are certain costs that are simply not priced into the market mechanism. Think of greenhouse gas emissions as the prime example. So in those cases, I mean, ideally, if you can find a way that you can implement a policy so that it is consistent with what companies would like to do on their own, then so much the better, right? But of course, for many problems, you need some kind of government intervention, you need some kind of regulation or taxation to overcome market failures. And in those cases, even then, there's always a lot of different ways that you can do that. And it's always useful to engage with all the stakeholders, not just the private sector, by the way, but all stakeholders. Because you also don't want to inadvertently impose unnecessary costs on the private sector. That would not be a wise idea. So it's always useful to have those discussions and to find the best possible way of doing that. But at the end of the day, it's also important that your policy process is still robust and doesn't get hijacked by certain interest groups, which, as we've discussed before. So it's very important that you keep that integrity, so that you want to hear all the different perspectives, you want to give all the stakeholders a chance to say what they have to say, but then in the end, you don't want one group to be able to capture that policy process.
Thanks, Cohen. A really interesting question next from Pippa, who was a bit late on the webinar because she had to go and get her cows in for milking in the Cheshire countryside. And what direction do you see farming going in the future? Should there be a move towards or away from the family farm? And what do you think are the impacts of each? So this kind of discussion of probably around farm size or ownership and land use.
Wow, that's a really broad question. It's really a big think question. To start with the family farming aspect, Actually, one of the remarkable constants, despite all the radical change that the global food system has seen, one of the remarkable constants is the survival of the family farm. So even in the United States, which is often held up as the example of industrialized big farming, there are a lot of very large farms there, but even those very large farms tend to be family farms. So there's several possible explanations for that, but it doesn't seem very likely that the family farm will disappear anytime soon. So, so that's just one observation there. More broadly, what will be the direction, or what should be the direction? I think ideally, you want to continue on this path of making sure that that the growth in output comes through efficiency gains as much as possible. So if you think about the different ways that you can increase food production, one is by using more land, as we discussed. And land use change is probably the most devastating way of increasing food production. So to give you an example, you've seen in my chart that the total increase in agricultural land has not been that enormous compared to the increase in food production. Even so, at the moment, something like 40% of the total emissions from food systems happen through land use change. So even that relatively small change in agricultural land use has massive effects on emissions, and of course, also for biodiversity and for just the other ecosystem services. So that is a very, very bad way of increasing agricultural production. Then the next best thing you could say is, well, if you do it through more inputs, more fertilizer and so on, it can help you save land, at least during the Green Revolution. The evidence shows that on average it was land saving. But there, of course, nitrogen, phosphates, those create environmental problems of their own. If you overuse water, then you can create problems there as well. So using more inputs is also, it comes with an environmental cost. So the best thing is that you have these kinds of efficiency gains, and you can actually achieve more useful stuff for people while using or putting less pressure on the environment and using fewer resources. And I'd like to take a broad view of what efficiency means, because if you think about, for example, levels of food loss and waste along the food supply chain and also at the household level and at retail level, that is also a form of efficiency losses. It means that we've been using certain costly resources and then there's no real gain for people at the end of the day. So you can take a broader view there, and ideally, I think that's the direction that food systems should move in. And part of that will come through, well, some of it might be behavioral change in the case of household food waste, for example. But on the farm level, I think, for example, the move towards precision agriculture can make a big difference. So we've already seen in many countries that that can allow you to basically produce more while using fewer inputs.
Good point, Koen. And thank you for that. Another great question here on this, seems to be a lot of interest in these deliberative processes. So this one is from Rachel Heading. What tactics and methods do you recommend in your deliberative process to help enable people to think about more critically about their values so they can be more effectively discussed and negotiated?
Well, that's a very difficult one. So I wanna point out that in our report, so in the chapter where we talk about facts, interests, and values, we take a very broad view, and we talk about these are the broadly speaking the main obstacles, and here are different good practices that you can use. So there's a couple of examples where people have used deliberative processes for food or agriculture related questions. I think the prime example is the Citizens Assembly in Ireland, which discussed whether or not to include agriculture in the climate change plan. So we haven't organized any deliberative processes ourselves, for example. So what we can say there is limited, and we also don't want to oversell it. It's, as with other things in food systems, it's not the silver bullet. It's one element in the toolbox. But for deliberative processes itself, because the question you're asking is not just relevant for food systems, it's relevant for any kind of issue that you would like to organize a deliberative process on. So the answer is that there is really a growing body of evidence on how to do that. And so there is a recent OECD report that summarizes a lot of those good practices. And every year, more places are organizing these deliberative processes. So the body of evidence on what works and what doesn't work is actually growing quite fast. So if that is of interest, I would encourage you to check out our recording of the deliberative processes webinar, or get in touch with us and we can put you in touch even with the author of that report if you want.
That's fantastic. And I think, as usual with N8 AgriFood events, there's just loads of questions. You never have to kind of think of any questions yourself as a chair. And we've got loads of questions we just won't have time to answer. But they're about right to food, they're about circular economy approaches, they're about crop diversity, and maybe we can do a little bit of offline work on that. But thank you everybody for their questions and a great Q&A. Koen, you were fantastic answering those questions. And now I'm going to hand over to Jonathan Brooks, who's a friend of the N8 AgriFood programme, presented at our conference in 2019 now, I think all that time ago. And over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thanks very much, Bob. And it was very nice to hear the questions and your comments. And I'm sorry we haven't had more time to come back to some very interesting points that were left here in the chat. Indeed, I remember the N8 AgriFood conference, and I mean, in some ways it seems like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? It really does. And we were commenting how fortunate it was to be able to do that at the time when so many events they've just not been able to take place. Anyway, it's been great to have this event with you. I've got just a couple of remarks, but just first you'll see flashed up a kind of evaluation of this webinar. So of course we always welcome your feedback, and we'd be delighted to hear from you on that, and we can make use of that information for future events, and including hopefully with yourselves at some time in the future. I mean, time is pretty much up, so just a kind of couple of quick remarks. Koen at the outset made the point that the OECD is engaged in a wide range of work, and a lot of what we do is cross-country comparative analysis. And so events like this, where we have the opportunity to engage at the national level, are really appreciated. And we think that can be a beneficial two-way experience, because if we see that cross-country comparative analysis picked up on in national processes where countries can learn from what others are doing and what we're seeing as common trends, that's obviously something that we're very, very pleased to see. And if it gets picked up either formally or informally and things that are feeding through into the UK's national food strategy, or indeed the N8's input into that national food strategy, then obviously that's a sign for us of what we would call policy impact, and we're delighted to have that. Equally, I think we've got things to learn from you, Bob, and your team about the kinds of things that you're doing and that the N8 stakeholders are engaged with, that we can in turn incorporate into our analysis. So I see this as a beneficial two-way street. Just a thought from another webinar I was in, and I was thinking about Koen's presentation, and maybe it's more just a thought to leave with, is I've been at a few events where the overriding message is what we need is radical, transformative policy change. And you think, well, that sounds good. And then you then say, well, we also need to mediate between trade-offs between different constituencies, between the interests possibly of farmers, of the needs of ensuring global food security across impacts on the environment and so forth. And that process of mediation risks immediately sounding less radical and less transformative. And I think, maybe there are some things in terms of next thinking about what, these wicked questions about, when that mediation is not always about compromise. It's about, can we find a way of deciding which way we go on one or the other way. So that's just a kind of thought to leave you there. We're currently working on our ag policies report, so there's a bit of a kind of shameless plug here really, but that work actually does suggest that there are some kind of radical and transformative changes that could be introduced in a fairly straightforward way. So Koen gave the overall numbers, but we're looking at considerably over $700 billion, as Koen said, that's transferred to the agriculture sector across 54 countries. About 300 of that is in the form of higher prices. And we know that that's an ineffective way of transferring income to farmers. We know it has adverse impacts on international markets. It stops trade fulfilling its role of providing food security. it stimulates greenhouse gas emissions, bad for the environment, you name it. So there's a clear case for reform of that. And then where the money's going, the other 400 billion is taxpayers' money across 54 countries. And so far, a lot of that is not encouraging sustainable productivity growth. I mean, the key thing is we know we need productivity growth, but it's essential that it's sustainable. And I think there were a lot of good questions there about productivity, but it's not enough just to have productivity. How do you make sure it's sustainable? And so you need innovation there, and that's been kind of not been at the center of where policy effort has been. So hopefully there are some big wins, but that's just a bit of a plug for our ag side of this work. But otherwise, I mean, I think there are a lot of very valuable points that were made, and I'm sure that Leanne, Koen, Ellie and the rest would be delighted to follow up offline with anybody on these points. So I think.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. So I'm sorry, I've not got my smooth, after all these months, I've not got my smooth webinar handovers worked out yet. But thank you.
Oh, well, thank you to all of you, to Leanne, to Koen, to Bob, to Jonathan for your thoughts today. It's been fabulous, given us all plenty of food for thought, and absolutely hits in on some of these key issues that so many of us are occupied with at the moment, thinking through those wicked problems. So thank you all for joining us today for this N8 Agri-Food Policy Hub webinar with OECD. And as mentioned previously, the link will be sent around to participants later, so you'll be able to access it online later. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank